Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. I wanted to invite Shane Morris back to join me and spend some time talking about what we've kind of lived through as a nation over the last week, and specifically over the last weekend. 3 shootings in a week, 2 mass shootings in 24 hours, 22 people shot at a Walmart in El Paso, 9 people killed in Dayton, Ohio. And, of course, that follows the shooting at the Gilroy Garlic Festival, which we talked about on last week's BreakPoint this week, but obviously not knowing that we were going to basically follow that with this level of destruction. And it's something that it seems has shaken Americans maybe in a new way. Maybe this is one of those kind of like, I remember this during the Sandy Hook shooting, because it involved children and because it involved elementary school children. There was a little bit more of a reckoning. Last week when we talked about the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting, one of the things that I brought up is how quickly people kind of jumped on their ideological battle lines even before information had come in, and assumed it was the president's fault, or assumed it was this person's fault, or assumed it was this, that, or the other. And the same thing happened. So even though I think that it feels to me, and maybe we're just kind of in the middle of the news cycle, Shane, that there's more of a conversation happening, that there's a more escalated and intense conversation happening, that maybe we're going to see some movement in terms of in ways that we haven't seen in before, whether it's in terms of public policy or whatever. But I'm not sure it's better informed conversation. It just seems like it's escalated at a level that we haven't seen. Gosh, it's so weird to say over the last several mass shootings, because we talk about these things now as if they're normal.
Yeah, John, thanks for having me on, by the way. We've got, within the space of a week here, 3 killed and more injured at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. In El Paso, we've got, so far, the body count is 22 at the Walmart there. And then in Dayton, Ohio, we've got another shooting from the very next day where 9 were killed, and then the shooter himself as well. This is the steady drumbeat here is inexorable. It feels like something just has to give, something has to happen. And part of that is the reality of the horror of these crimes, and part of it, I think, is also the way we've come to talk about these things and cover them in the U.S. As a country and as a media and as a body politic. We regroup them according to certain criteria. We don't talk about shootings in general this way. The mass shooting has become an icon, a dark icon of American culture, and a sort of rallying point for all kinds of different legislative and social causes.
Yeah, it has. And I think I want to start there because you asked a really interesting question on your Facebook page, which was essentially, why is it that we pull these away from other acts of gun violence? Why do we talk about them with kind of the alarm? In other words, does the incident itself justify, kind of that sort of response? And I think that's a really interesting question, because I think a lot of people, look, we certainly have more media coverage, but is it true that there are more shootings? Well, the truth is yes, that there has been an uptick in these things, at least according to many of the, at least in the American context, and certainly in the 70s. And that hits at one of the big narratives, which is that we need to restrict access to guns. Well, look, Americans have had access to guns for a long time. Now, one could argue that the speed at which modern semi-automatic weapons are able to release rounds is different than in times past, and so so that's why the shootings are worse, and that's why we have to do more gun control and gun legislation. But that's a real live question for me, right? Which is, why in times past, when Americans had even greater access to firearms and even kind of a higher percentage of the population, why didn't we see these same sorts of kind of mass shootings? Or did we? Now, the numbers that I've seen say that there has been an obvious uptick. But there's also kind of the daily gun violence, and many people bring this up. Inner city Chicago, inner city communities. When you have kind of day in and day out. A typical weekend in Chicago, X number of people shot, and that doesn't make anybody's newspaper. So there does seem to be a real problem that we have in even knowing how to talk about these things to begin with.
Right. The Washington Post back in January, I think it was, released a fascinating set of polls and statistics about the perception gap with regard to gun violence in the United States, specifically gun homicides. And what was striking is that the majority of Americans, the vast, overwhelming majority of Americans, especially Democrats, think that gun homicides are worse now than they've ever been before. And the reality, according to the FBI Joint Crime Statistics, is that gun violence is actually near a 25-year low right now. The highest it was in recent history was in 1993, and we're down significantly from that. And yet there's this massive perception gap that's increased over time. So what's causing that? And given the perception gap, is it rational to single out? My question on Facebook was, is it rational to single out a particular class of gun homicides, i.e. mass shootings, defined as 4 victims plus in a single incident, I think within less than 24 hours. Is it rational to sort of single those out and have week-long or 2-week-long wall-to-wall coverage of them as a nation? And there are a lot of answers to that question that people have offered me on social media. Friends I've discussed this with have offered. So one of them is that mass shootings happen in places that we normally consider safe, shopping malls, movie theaters, churches, and that makes them uniquely scary in a way that I don't think inner city drug or gang violence, which accounts for a significant proportion of gun homicides in general, it is scary. I mean, there is a level of sensationalism here. My chances of actually getting involved in one of these shootings is still very low. If we, average it out, the victims of of what we think of as mass shootings come out to somewhere like 25 to 30 people a year. Obviously, averages are weird when you're dealing with these small numbers. More people than that were shot in Las Vegas, but the numbers in a country of 350 million are relatively small compared to the somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 people a year who are murdered with guns, not counting suicides, by the way. So I think we have to carefully distinguish what is it that makes this phenomenon different, this mass shooting phenomenon, and why is it that we focus on it and argue about it so so incessantly as a country.
I think one of the things, though, that's worth pointing out is exactly kind of where these shootings do take place. I mean, we are talking about kind of a violation of innocence. In fact, the manifesto written by the El Paso shooter specifically said, don't call me a coward because I'm targeting innocence. The idea is to kill as many people as possible, and that prolongs the ability for me to do that. But, we're talking about, schools and churches and synagogues, and we're talking about Walmarts. The other thing, though, that's a commonality, too, is that almost universally we're talking about men shooting, and specifically young men, and mostly young white men. And so when you talk about inner city shootings, you're talking about, primarily African American perpetrators or, ethnic minority perpetrators. But on all these mass shootings, I mean, there are a few exceptions, but there's kind of a cultural unity here too. Now, of course, that's been highlighted by so many in the media to say that, it's toxic masculinity, it's toxic white culture, and that sort of thing. Again, percentage-wise, I don't think it would bear that out. But if we do have an uptick, and by the way, Jonathan Last actually had a really interesting piece in which he, talked about these disturbing, the disturbing uptick. He linked to an Axios.com chart, which was from Mother Jones, and these aren't sources that I would typically consider reliable. But when you kind of put all this together, there is kind of this mass of this particular kind of crime that takes place, that's a particular evil, that's targeting innocence, and that's almost universally carried out by young white men. I mean, there are exceptions, but that's really it. And that has to tell us something about what's happening in our world. And I think it's got to tell us something that doesn't lead us into kind of a reverse the El Paso shooter posted this kind of, white nationalist, white supremacist, racist, anti-immigrant screed, basically indicting an entire group of people. It's no more fair to turn around and indict an entire group of people because they're young and white, as if that's the issue. Again, we've had access to guns for a long time and not seen this particular type of evil carried out in the public square against innocents. That tells you, I think it's got to tell us at least something about the brokenness in our culture.
Well, we often hear the stereotype of, the future mass shooter kid, the socially awkward, quiet loner who's interacted mostly with people in, internet forums and fringe corners of the web. And it's an incredibly cruel, and terrible thing to say. But there's a basis of truth in there. I remember, I think it was with my brother, I was watching Stranger Things Season 2, and there's a character named Jonathan Byer, and he sort of fits that description of the quiet, socially awkward loner who's bullied. And I don't remember whether it was in the show or a remark my brother made, but someone said, yeah, Jonathan Byer is future school shooter material. And the fact that we say things like that tells me that this description has really become consistent. As you mentioned...
what's interesting, though, Shane, let me jump in, because you're right. I mean, everyone would say, yeah, because I've seen the show, and that's exactly right. But again, the show's picturing the 1980s.
Right.
And I can't remember if it's in the show or not either, but there weren't these things in the 1980s, right? I mean, if it had happened in the 1980s, it would have set everybody off. It was really Columbine, and there was a handful right before Columbine, but was all within a few months. Columbine was kind of this kind of cultural event that kind of changed everything, and so that's what's so interesting too. It's kind of another anachronism to say that about 1980s high school culture. It was just unheard of then.
Yeah, it was. Columbine happened while I was young, but I remember it as a turning point for certain. It shocked the country in a way that few crimes up to that point had. I don't think it was really overshadowed, to be honest, until September 11th. There was nothing that really sent America reeling like Columbine, just because of the sheer nihilism of the boys who took up arms against their classmates there. And that brings us to what I think is another important distinction to make. These mass shootings often get lumped together in the media as sort of the same kind of crime, or even worse, they get lumped together by just the type of weapon used, which is its own conversation. But the distinction I want to make, I think is important to make, is between two different kinds of troubled young men. And it is predominantly young men who do this. The first is the ideologue, the one who gets radicalized in anti-Semitic or anti-immigrant or racist forums online. That kind of person wants to kill as many, as the case with the El Paso shooter, wants to kill as many of an ethnic minority as possible. Or some of the synagogue shooters, or the church shooter in Charleston. So that's the ideologue. The other kind of person is the nihilist. And this is what you saw more with the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting, and I think the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting, and a number of others. That there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to it. It wasn't a specific racial hatred, and oftentimes these shooters simply want to kill as many people as possible indiscriminately, and then often in their own lives in the process. And the best way to describe it that I know how is nihilism. That these are just lost young men who have just surrendered completely to the hatred in their hearts. So, John, what do you think it is that we can learn from distinguishing those two? Because I know we've talked about this in the last couple of days.
Yeah, we have. We talked about it a lot, and I wanted to share that conversation on BreakPoint this past week. I try to deal with this. The first is, why is it that we are seeing so many young men so susceptible to, let's start with the ideological extremism. Why are we seeing the young men so susceptible to that? Now, there's been a lot of conversation this week about online sites that, tolerate the sort of, disgusting, racist, white supremacist, even, threatening violent sort of language like 8chan and so on, and 4chan. That's like saying, the problem is the gun. again, there's been guns in America forever. Why are we seeing this uptick now? There's tools in our hands forever. I don't think just the fact that a platform exists. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't take that platform down. If you ask me, I think 8chan should be taken down tomorrow. But
the creator of 8chan himself has asked for the site to be shut down.
Right, yeah. And so that's what I wanted to talk about this week. And on Tuesday's BreakPoint is that, why does he say that? Well, maybe in a different sort of culture with a different sort of moral formation that would take place in the hearts and lives of young people, particularly young men, that a forum that has very little rules, would be acceptable and would, be okay. But we don't have that sort of culture. And, I wrote about this week, and I at least had, one of our folks write back and say, are you for gun control? Even though it's specifically in this, the BreakPoint, I said, I am a Second Amendment guy. Don't think gun control is an answer, and I don't think it's even feasible to even implement. But freedom is dependent on virtue. And when you have a culture that cannot govern itself, and you have citizens that cannot govern themselves, that reaches a particular point where you need, as Chuck Colson said, if you don't have the conscience, you need the constable. And the whole line, I think, that the answer to, bad guys with guns is good guys with guns. I completely agree with that in principle, but there reaches a point when the bad guys are willing to attack anywhere and everywhere. Then you have to do the math, and it's a whole new math problem, which is, okay, if we need more good guys with guns, how many good guys do we need to deal with the bad guys? And not only that, where do we need them? I mean, we know we need good guys with guns, between North Korea and South Korea on the border, or at the front line of a war where the enemy is trying to encroach on your land. Of course, you need it there. But when we're talking about Walmarts and churches and synagogues and all of that, then we just have either a thoroughly armed populace, or you actually need the good guys with guns to increase, and that means a bigger police force. I often talk about this about William Wilberforce and the reforms that the Clapham Group meant. One of the outcomes of that was that the police force shrunk after the moral reforms of the Clapham Group and Victorian England. Well, it's the exact opposite that's true as well. If we need a whole lot more good guys with guns to deal with all the bad guys with guns, well, that becomes a police state. Now, I know what some people are saying. No, we need to arm every citizen. Okay, well, that's a different conversation about gun rights. What I'm talking about is what's inevitable. And we right now do not have a morally grounded society. And we've said this forever. I mean, Chuck Colson said this forever. But eventually, kind of the predictions is, if you are not people of character, then you cannot maintain your freedoms. Well, we've seen that throughout history. That's like a historical rule of thumb. It cannot be broken. It's the way things go. And, I spent the weekend kind of wondering, look, I don't want to be alarmist. I don't want to be, melodramatic here. But we read through history, and we read about events that are kind of the gasp and the kind of the crazy things that mark the end of a civilization that's dying. And you kind of look at this and go, is this going to be in that list for readers of history, decades and decades and decades from now? Clearly, we're not the sort of society that is forming virtuous citizens. And when you can't govern yourself, the math just doesn't work anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I think the conversation about mass shootings becomes much more grounded and makes a lot more sense outside of just sensationalism and panic, when you realize that the young men who are grabbing guns and going to kill as many people as they can are the tip of an iceberg. They're the dramatic minority in a phenomenon that is nationwide and that encompasses millions rather than dozens of individuals. I think they're just the extreme thing that gets our attention. So something is wrong in this country with young men. I've seen that sort of put forward again and again as the obvious root issue. If you look at the left and the right, both of the political sides are proposing what I would call instrumental policy solutions. So whether or not you think gun control would work, whether or not you think more armed citizens would work, or guards at schools and things like that, both of those are they're meant to address the symptoms of the problem, if that makes sense. They're security measures, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think the rationale behind that is fine, and even the smarter thinkers on the left don't think that guns are the problem per se. They just think that getting guns out of the hands of bad people is a way to keep them from killing so many innocents. But neither of those really gets to the core of the problem, and you hit on it right there. What is the core of the problem? And I think there's a convincing case to be made that something's wrong with young men in this country. They are falling through the cracks and falling into extremism or despondency for the majority in a way that hasn't been true in the past.
Yeah, we talked about that today on BreakPoint, and you and I put together that commentary, and it's a really important point, and we need to walk through it very carefully because, the two things. Number one is that the studies that have been done about these mass shooters reveal this commonality that they're men, that they're almost exclusively young men, and that they had a very either rough childhood or weren't raised with their dad, and so they gravitated towards something else. And then so that's the one thing. There is a set of commonalities that you can point to. In fact, we cited an article by two researchers that identified 4 of those commonalities, right? That there was some tragedy early on in their life, that they emulated and idolized some of these, kind of mass shooters in history, that they sought out validation in some of these extreme communities. And then, what was the fourth one? Oh, yeah.
They had access.
They're kind of loners with an identifiable crisis point. Right. And then, you can also say they had access. And so the access is one of those things to a weapon or something like that. But you don't get a shooter without the rest of those four things. But the other thing that you and I talked about is you can have all 4 of those things, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to create a mass shooter, including access. So what does it create? What we do see, and you and this is, I think, what you're trying to say in terms of this kind of tip of the iceberg, and we have to walk through this very carefully because we're not equating all problems that young men are facing as if they're equal, as if choosing to become a mass shooter is the same as being addicted to Fortnite. But right. When you look at how young men are doing in our culture, and I don't mean like how they're doing in terms of, happiness, or in terms of even financial success, or even in terms of, our friend Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas has written about sexual economics. In fact, sexually, men are actually basically not having to contribute anything and getting all the sex that they want, either through porn or because of the whole sexual marketplace. And he's argued that. So, I guess you could say in that sense, quote unquote, they're doing well. But they're what I mean by not doing well is they're not growing up. We have a problem of perpetual adolescence that we talked about in the book. We have a problem of meaninglessness. We have a problem of addiction. We have a problem of silliness and the lack of responsibility. We have the problem that young men are taking longer and longer and longer to cross the traditional thresholds of adulthood. And so if you back up 30,000 feet and see these extreme ways that young men are living out the meaninglessness and the hopelessness and asking the question, how are they getting radicalized in either a nihilism or in kind of a either Islam or which we've seen shootings from that perspective, or certainly white supremacy. When we ask why, to me it's all the same story, which is that our culture is desperately failing young men, and it's not because it's hard on them. It's because it basically isn't giving them any bigger vision of life than themselves. And the institutions that are tasked with that, the home, the church, think of even of the Boy Scouts, how important the Boy Scouts have been in American society and how quickly that organization has all but crumbled. And not only that, but the vacuum that was left in its place in terms of developing young men. If we don't see this connection between the loss of the ability of our culture to form young men and these devastating consequences, then we're not paying attention.
Yeah, and one of the tenets of the Christian worldview, since Augustine sort of formalized it in the doctrine of original sin, is that people are not born neutral. we're not born tabula rasa. We're not born blank slates. We have a bent toward evil. And part of the role of family and society and all of these institutions, as you've just talked about, is to form and catechize people, but especially men, in the direction of socially contributing behaviors and peaceful lives and productive lives and things like this. And that's not just true on the level of converting them, although that's certainly the ultimate good. It's true on a cultural level, too. This sort of effervescent grace, as Calvin would put it, that the presence of a godly minority actually sanctifies, in an earthly sense, those around them. It teaches them how to live the good life. So young men, if left to their own and isolated and simply, thrown to the wolves, will not tend to develop in a good direction. There's a lot of grace, there are a lot of extraordinary stories, but the tendency will be to develop in a bad direction. And as you mentioned, most of the time that looks like sort of mundane despondency and addiction to video games and pornography and lack of participation in society and so forth. But there are these rare cases where it goes even further, where the evil that's already present in the human heart is inflamed and given occasion and made operational in an absolutely terrifying way. So, but we don't have the means of countering that. Where are the institutions and pathways that lead young men in a good and productive and wholesome and socially acceptable direction? I don't really see those unless you go out and seek them and make them yourselves.
Yeah, and so one wonders, and I want to kind of turn the conversation in our last few minutes this direction. And so one wonders, is this a unique and distinct calling of the church today? I mean, one of the things we talk about at the Colson Center, and I talk about over and over and over, is this truth that I find in Acts 17 when Paul's describing who God is to the Epicureans and Stoics, and says all kinds of really interesting things, but specifically that God determines the exact times that people live in the boundaries of their dwelling place. So start there. If we are called to this time in this place, and this time in this place is defined by, again, I don't want to just look at it as these kind of extreme incidents of mass shootings, although we've got to do everything we can to stop all of those things, including specifically going after ideologies like white supremacy. But is the church now called to take up the mantle that our culture has desperately dropped the ball on, which is cultivating and discipling young men? It might be the most important thing that a church can do right now. You don't have healthy young women if you don't have healthy young men. You don't have healthy young women if you don't have healthy dads. And if you have an abusive situation where women are promised kind of liberation, quote unquote, and what they get instead is a bunch of bonehead knuckleheads who are somewhere between, cruel and violent and to just worthless, right? In other words, I think the church has been placed in this cultural moment always for such a time as this. Like, that's every church needs to look around and, as N.T. Wright said, what time is it and what should we be about doing? And, I'm grateful, for example, for the rebirth of Promise Keepers, which is in the works right now and it's going to relaunch in 2020. And the CEO of that's a good friend of mine, and he had no plans to kind of find himself in this situation, but he's like, we need it now more than ever. And I'm thinking, now after the last weekend, yeah, maybe God is doing that. And you look across the board, and who possibly has the answer to helping young men be young men? I mean, you're not going to see it in government. You're certainly not going to see it in Hollywood. You're not going to see it in education. You're not going to see it almost anywhere. I think the best places you find it is in some of these brilliant initiatives around entrepreneurship and business, and of course, ultimately the church, because the church has the power to really help shape and support the family. And we don't fix the family. We don't fix young men. We don't fix the family. We don't fix in the long term this kind of crisis of moral foundations that's crumbling around us. And I mean, gosh, I feel like I'm, sounding like Gandalf here, like judgment will come, and it kind of is. I think, you let young men run on their own without any institutions of moral formation, and this is what you get. So the church has to step in. The church is the only thing that can step in right now.
Right, and when the young men object, we'll have to tell them, like Gandalf, I'm not trying to rob you, I'm trying to help you. here. The church has reformed or contributed to reforming societies in worse shape than ours. I think that was something you mentioned the last time I was on with you on the BreakPoint podcast, talking about purity culture and Joshua Harris, that we have a unique opportunity here to restructure and influence our society in ways that are very similar and often overlap with the area we're talking about here in the formation of young men. That includes their sexuality. If the church can be a sanctifying influence over the course of centuries on a civilization where throwing baby girls out to the wolves is an acceptable practice, and pederasty and all these things you see in the Greco-Roman world, I think we can do the same thing here. We are in a bit of a unique situation because we are a post-Christian society rather than what we would think of as a pre-Christian society. But yeah, I sense that unique calling. And I don't know what all of the specific ways we implement that calling are. I think just welcoming and inviting young men to an extent can be powerful, offering them not replacement fathers, but fellow men who can show them what it looks like to succeed in life, to be happy, be at peace with those around them, to not have to resort to these sort of extreme ideologies. Just what it means to be human well, because again, as I said, they're not gonna gravitate in that direction if left to their own devices.
Yeah, and look, you and we have got a really clear call. I mean, you need to look after your boy, and I need to look after my boy. And I think along the way, we need to invite other, young men who do not have that stable influence into our lives. And I think that's one of the things that the church needs to really wrestle with is, man, we don't like getting our hands dirty in kind of the brokenness and the mess of the world, but that's always where Christians are at their best. You think of Christians running into the plague, Christians running into the fight, Christians running into the brokenness, and that's what I'm saying is that the war zone is all around us, and young men are just casualties left and right. And so let's take care of our boys, and let's see who else we can take care of along the way with God's help. You've been listening to the BreakPoint podcast. My guest has been Shane Morris. We've been talking about the shootings of the last 7 to 10 days in America. And again, come to breakpoint.org. If you click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, we'll link you to some of the resources we mentioned on today's episode. Thanks for joining us.